It seems like this could be real change. Goldman has significant influence. They were the top U.S. underwriter last year, one of the top 3 in the last decade. This is more than a PR stunt. What do you think?
Yeah, well, even if there's never an IPO they refuse to do, what they're probably going to do is make every IPO that wants Goldman to underwrite it to have a diverse board. I mean, I think that's what's more likely to happen. They're going to, the tail's going to wag the dog into doing what it wants done rather than having to refuse business. So I think it's kind of PR, but it's also a real ultimatum that they'll be able to enforce before the company goes public.
Well, and we should make this clear, it's in the U.S. and Europe to start. So, Abby, I want to
Correct.
fold you in because the interesting thing here is that you're seeing a lot of IPOs come in the tech space. So this could have some significant ramifications, if you will, for the tech sector.
Yeah, that's right, Taylor. I mean, I think the pressure's been building for quite a while for people to pay attention to a lot of the ESG issues, and diverse boards is certainly at the lead of that. And I think what we're seeing is, as it relates to technology, where there's a lot of companies that are built up over time that aren't paying attention to these issues, all of a sudden the spotlight's on them, and they're really going to have to step up and pay attention to these pressures that they're getting from all different sides.
And Abby, it was interesting, we were talking about not having an all-white, all-straight male board, but the definition of diversity is changing as well. It's not just including women now. How do you see them also trying to include more diversity in the corporate boards?
Right. So, as we were talking earlier, the gender diversity is gotten most of the attention. First of all, it's easier to tell when you're looking at an S1, usually. But also, I think it's because it was so disproportionate when you look at our society, employees, customers, shareholders, the disproportionate gender issues. However, there's a lot more attention being paid to different types of diversity, which has a lot to do with why is diversity important to begin with. Mm-hmm. And the value of diversity being more around bringing in other perspectives and having a good, constructive, maybe a debate, but nonetheless a healthier, more value added to that board when you look at it through a few different lenses. And that's why diversity really matters.
And Jeff, you were taking a look at this story. David Solomon saying, of course, focusing on July 1st on the US and Europe, but notably excluding Asia. And we talk about technology. A lot of the big tech IPOs are coming from Asia. Is Goldman Sachs maybe not going far enough by excluding Asia from this conversation?
Well, a majority of their business is in the U.S. and Europe, so they're kind of hitting their core. And Asia's complicated. I mean, if you think about it, by the criteria they set, every board in Asia is already diverse because it has a predominance of Asian people on it, which in the U.S. counts as diverse. So when you start to talk about diversity outside of the U.S., it looks a lot different because we look at race. Most of the rest of the world does not consider race the same way that the U.S. does. And, as you were saying, for most of the world, gender is the diversity. But, by that measure, Asia still looks pretty bad. So, I mean, if they were to extend this to Asia, I'm going to guess there's going to be more IPOs that would have trouble and maybe more resistant to this, which is maybe why it's taken a little longer for them to bring Asia in.
And Jeff, I wanted to get your thoughts. We talk about now including diversity in the IPO stage. What about before that moment, the founding of these companies? Yeah. How do we start to include this before we get to the IPO stage?
Well, you got to figure out how to fix funding. I mean, when you look at the scarce amount of money that's available from diverse funds to begin with, and I mean, pretty much all the research suggests is how a fund starts out or how a company starts out is how they're going to end up. So if a company starts out with 5 men, it's going to look a lot like that 3 years from now. If you don't have women sort of joining at the beginning, if they're not empowered, if they're not getting funded to start these companies, you're really not going to see much difference 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now. And that's been borne out repeatedly now. So it's kind of like got to be right from not just from pre-IPO, but from foundation. The founders have to be more diverse.
Abby, your take on that?
Yeah, I think you and Jeff are going into a really interesting part about all of this. So we looked at the last dozen IPOs just, in 2020 or what's queued up to go in the next week or so. What's sort of phenomenal is in those dozen IPOs, there's only one company where they've had 2 women on the board for more than a year. All the rest of them have women that are teed up to be nominees upon the completion of the IPO or have gone on within the last couple of months. And I think what's really important is just checking the box and putting a woman or any kind of diverse person on a board falls way short of what the whole point is about having diverse boards.
And what's interesting, Abby, is you take a look at the S&P 500, it seems like some of these multinational, larger cap companies have actually done a better job than some of these smaller startups where maybe there is a bit of a sense of checking the box to get to the IPO. Why is it that some of these multinational companies are doing a better job and yet some of these startups, which is supposed to be an innovative culture, can't get there?
I think it's all about visibility. Pressure's on. You've got, a broader shareholder base. I think the work of State Street and BlackRock and Vanguard is really sort of coming into bear. And if you think about who picks the board, it is the shareholders, right? So go back to Jeff's earlier point of how these companies are being founded, who's behind them. We need to start at that level, at that earlier stage level. And by the way, bringing more diversity onto your board 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before you go public is going to help that company be more ready to be public. So there's really a win-win.
Jeff, what do you see as you take a look? Yeah, please comment, Jeff.
I was going to say a key part of this is sort of the equivalent of BlackRock or Vanguard saying we're not going to vote for your boards anymore. Now you have this sort of line in the sand for the IPO. So companies are going to be thinking, what do I need to do 2 or 3 years from now to go public? I better be thinking about it now. And I think Goldman learned something from WeWork. I mean, they were part of that, and that was a disaster. They came to the market without a diverse board, and people start asking questions and then more questions. And pretty soon there's no IPO.
Jeff, who is next? Goldman. After Goldman, you had Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan. Who do we expect to come out next?
I don't know. I asked both JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, and they weren't volunteering it. And if you think about it, we have Citigroup put out some pay numbers. We had Intel put out some really detailed numbers about their workforce and gender and race and pay that no one's ever done before. And they're still the only ones to have done that. So just because somebody leads does not mean somebody's going to follow. This is scary stuff. I mean, if you look at my inbox, my Twitter feed, my LinkedIn, and probably many other people who followed this, it's pretty scary to see the kind of reaction to what they did.
Abby, your take?
Yeah, so I'm going to trust Jeff's reporting. He asked all of them, but I want to know who's first on the investor side. Who's going to step up and say, we will not buy an IPO that doesn't have the type of diversity? The same way that BlackRock came out just 2 weeks ago, Larry Fink's letter that said, climate change, we're paying attention to this. I'm really looking forward to seeing the institutions say, this matters so much that we're not in without doing it the right way.
Sort of brings us back down to activism coming from all different fronts.